Today's sermon is titled Early Chinese in Cambria and SLO County, Stories and Anecdotes from News Clippings, to be delivered by John Seed. The sermon covers the following principles. Principle 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Principle 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And principle 6, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. John is a professor emeritus of art and art history at Mount San Jacinto College. Because of his interest in Asian art and culture, John was drawn to the Chinese temple at Green Space Reserve when he moved to Cambria with his wife Linda and younger daughters Evan and Condi 3.5 years ago. He is currently serving as president of the Green Space Board of Directors and divides his time between running Green Space meetings, writing about art and walking his dogs, Ricky and Daisy, and helping me polish and present the Nature Club newsletters. Welcome, John.
Well, welcome to those of you that are actually here, and welcome to those of you that are virtually here. It's a hybrid service, and bear with me as I make sure that I don't. I've been told by students online that I scrunch my nose when I'm Zooming, so I'll get cues if I'm doing anything wrong. But hopefully you can hear me and enjoy the presentation. Let me tell you how the presentation came about. Thank you, Randy. Okay, all right. The way this presentation came about is that at the beginning of the summer, my family and I took a college trip. We wanted to show my 17-year-old some colleges. We made a beautiful loop up through Northern California all the way to the top, and we came down through Mendocino. And there was a surprise for me when we got to Mendocino. After becoming so interested in the Chinese temple at the Green Space Reserve and being so involved and learning from that experience, it really delighted me to find that there was a Chinese temple in Mendocino. I hadn't heard about it before. I didn't know much about it, but I called a cell phone number on their website, and I was met at the temple. And the woman who met me, her name is Lorraine He Chorley, and she spent an hour with me. She gave me a very, very personal tour. Their temple is still a functioning Taoist temple, and it's functioned the same way for nearly 150 years. And the story goes that her great-great-grandfather built it with $12 worth of redwood. And I don't know what $12 was at the time that he built it. And so she and other relatives and family members took part in restoring it about 10 years ago. And it actually functions as a temple. They have Chinese from the mainland and from locally who do come and use it. So it's a fully functioning temple. And being there gave me all kinds of ideas about what a temple could and should be, and it gave me ideas for green space. But the other thing that happened was that Lorraine shared some stories with me. And she told me that her older relatives, back to when she was a little girl, had a lot of stories about fires. She said they always talked about, back in the old days, and this would be back, in the 19th century or early 20th century, this Chinese laundry was set on fire, or this home was set on fire, and they had all kinds of awful stories that came forward. So hearing these firsthand, it brought out the historian in me. I teach online and I do research about art, and I'm interested in databases and ways of doing research. And I discovered, based in UC Riverside, there's now a complete online digital archive of newspapers going all the way back to the 1850s. And the first thing I want to mention, a practical thing for people enjoying my presentation, don't feel like you need to adjust your glasses and try and read these clippings. It's in a way, it's kind of a mistake to put clippings with small print online. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to read you bits and pieces of them. And then if any of you want to see the original clippings, I'll email them to you or enlarge them, make it more readable. But I want these kind of here as to validate my presentation. I want to let you know it's my research. It's an objective presentation. I want to tell you what I found because I am mesmerized and deeply interested in what I found. So the SLO Tribune printed this in 1873, and it actually was generated by a San Francisco newspaper. So it's a San Francisco news item. And this made me realize that in 1873, there was a tremendous surge of anti-Chinese feeling. And it happened because most of the Chinese here had been working on the railroads. And then when the railroad, when the great connecting railroad was done, a lot of them were unemployed and looked for other work. That's probably a time when a lot came here to Cambria and also up to Monterey. And this, if you read this, it's kind of an editorial piece. It's very, very searing. And I'll just read you a sentence of it. Who have built a filthy nest of iniquity and rottenness in our very midst? The Chinese. How about one more? Who fill our workshops to the exclusion of white labor? The Chinese. And I could go on. But this gave me a historical moment. Here's something that was printed in major newspapers. Here's some of the sentiment that was out there. Looking at some of the research that Wayne has done, and Wayne has mentored me, and I've tried to build on what he did. He certainly has told us a lot about the Chinese that were in our local area. And of course, you see here, there's the photo of Lewis, whose store still stands in San Luis Obispo. And I am going to talk a little about the San Luis Obispo area in my presentation, and I'm going to mention Lewis later on. But mainly this slide is here to acknowledge that, Wayne kind of got this research going, and I hope I found a few clippings that he never found before, and I'm kind of expanding on what he did. So here's a local item. This is from Cambria in 1878, 5 years after that editorial. Charles Lyon, who has been bulldozing Chinamen in Cambria, was brought down on Thursday and lodged in the county jail for 20 days. And I read that and I went to Google, what is bulldozing? Bulldozing is a racist beating, and it is a term that was used for beatings of both African Americans and Chinese. It's based on the idea that when you're trying to manage a bull, you would whip the bull, you'd have a bullwhip. And it's when you apply the same kind of brutality to a human being. And this clipping is remarkable in that it names the citizen involved, and not all of them do. So did we have, this kind of violence in Cambria? Yes, we did, in this period following the completion of the railroad. And let's see. Here's something that is a little bit lighter. I think this is one way that in San Luis Obispo and in Cambria that everybody got to know the Chinese community. It turns out everyone loved Chinese New Year. So from the SLO Tribune of 1881, Chinese residents of the city celebrated their New Year Saturday and Sunday. They made the usual amount of noise with gongs, firecrackers, and other heathenish devices for creating disturbances. So there's a judgment there, of course, in heathenish, but you can also see a certain fascination with the Chinese New Year. In 1881, here's a disturbing one, but I'll read it objectively, and then we can, maybe at the end of the service, we'll talk about some of these. Rumors of the perpetration of a brutal and malicious assault upon an inoffensive Chinaman near Cambria on Sunday are current upon our streets. The real facts in the case have not been received, but according to report, 2 or 3 young men, sons of respectable farmers residing up the Santa Rosa Creek, were riding into town on horseback when they overtook or met a Chinese vegetable peddler. One of the young men, out of pure wantonness, attempted to ride over the Chinaman when the latter endeavored to protect himself with the pole on which he was carrying his baskets. Thereupon the valiant American jerked the pole out of the Chinaman's hands and beat him over the head and face with it in a brutal manner. It is said that the Chinaman's face was horribly cut. He went to Cambria to have his wounds dressed, and when the outrage became known, great indignation was expressed by the better class of people. and the crime was denounced in unequivocal terms. And it goes on to say that there is a fund for the injured young man. But again, historical context. And one thing that stands out to me about this clipping, they say sons of the better families, but the names were withheld. So, another, just a bit of reality about what was the tension and what was happening in this area. Here's one from 1886, driving Chinese from work. Now, this one happens in Nipomo, and I want to mention Nipomo in a minute because Linda and I just visited up there. But this one describes how a gang of Chinese laborers were driven away from work in Arroyo Grande. And it says here the parties who drove the Chinese from work are unknown. But the thing that stands out here is Chinese workers were told to pack up and threatened with hanging if they did not leave a work site. When we went to Nipomo, I don't know if you've toured the adobe that's there, but we went and took the tour. It mentions they had Chinese cooks. And I think Chinese cooks were a fixture of California culture for a long time. And they have a photo there of one of their two cooks, and we saw the room that they lived in. And in 1889, there was a Chinese-style funeral giving for Mr. Li Gun, who they call a celestial. By the way, the celestial is one of the words, one of the names that was given to the Chinese. And I want to mention from the introduction, Gold Mountain is what the Chinese called California in both the introductory readings. But this one mentions that Chinese bands of 6 pieces will play as part of the ceremonies. So there was a Chinese Exclusion Act that was enacted in 1882, and for 10 years it forbade immigration. And that may be where the poem came from a time when someone tried to immigrate and was instead held in detention. But by 1892, Chinese were again being admitted. And here's an example of a certificate given out in San Francisco that a Chinese laborer carried. And all Chinese after 1892 had these significance. Here's another notice about just partying. 1894, this is in Cayucos. There was a great noise in Cayucos on Saturday night. A party of masqueraders from some of the dairies, not more than, this must be a typo, 1,000 miles away, dropped in and proceeded to paint the town red, which sounds like maybe partying with the Chinese, painting the town red. I wonder if there's a connection. The proceedings were enlivened by a couple of fights in which masqueraders were promptly done up by local champions. All who took part in this celebration, which we've been told was in commemoration of the Chinese New Year, had a very large time until cow time came. I like that clipping. If you've wondered about opium on the Central Coast, this is from 1894. An opium den was raided in SLO, and this clipping speculates it's not the only one existing in Chinese quarters of this city. This matter should be thoroughly investigated. Let me go, I need to go forward. We're in Cambria again. Here is a local event that I have never heard of before, but it's a Cambria fire noted in January of 1898, and I'll read the clipping. The shower which came last Monday evening presented a widespread conflagration in the town of Cambria. Once before in its history, the little town nestled among the pines came very close to nearly being swept out of existence by the cruel flames. Does that sound like now? There might have been a repetition on Monday night, except for the prompt visitation of a heavy shower. A fire caught in a Chinese wash and storehouse and speedily demolished that structure, spreading to a barn belonging to the Perry estate and recently occupied as a livery and feed stable by Clarence Davis, now of Guadalupe. Both buildings were completely destroyed. The loss is probably 1,500. And I think if I were to contact my friend in Mendocino, I think she would probably note that this was arson, or it certainly seems like it was arson. Just after that, this is October, a number of Cambria people have come forward with a petition. We, the undersigned citizens of Cambria, do hereby petition your honorable body to take some action for the protection of abalones on the coast. There are a number of Chinese here engaged in gathering, drying, and shipping abalones to China. So, more tension, more retribution. Here's another one, 1899. 3 incendiary fires were started yesterday in Superintendent Taylor's residence on the ranch owned by Mrs. Phoebe Hearst and W.R. Hearst near San Simeon, 30 miles from here. They were discovered before much damage was done. A Chinese cook was arrested on suspicion and held for trial. 30 laborers struck for higher wages, shorter hours, and better food a week ago. Their demands were not allowed, and all left the ranch. It is supposed the Chinaman fired the residents through sympathy for the striking laborers. But there's more. I wanted to say something about Hearst because Wayne and I did a webinar maybe a year and a half ago for Greenspace, and we had a historian from Hearst Castle on the webinar, and she asked, what connection was there between William Randolph Hearst and the Chinese? And he always denied using Chinese labor. That came up a lot during his life and career. But of course, we all know that he was responsible for newspapers that promoted the idea of yellow peril, first Chinese and then Japanese, closer to World War II. So in that context, this clipping is very, very striking. From the 1913 Stockton Independent, thousands of Chinese going to Mexico. And the date line is San Francisco. 467 Chinese coolies, the first consignment of 5,000, arrived here by the liner Chiyomaru, bound for the Mexican ranchos of William Randolph Hearst and General Harrison Gray Otis and Harry Chandler. Immigration officers say 90% of them are afflicted with hookworms. For this reason, they would be detained as undesirable aliens, whatever their nationality. So again, I think that's a very, very significant clipping that Chinese coolie labor was shipped en masse to the Hearst Ranch in Mexico. That is the only photo I've seen of Chinese in Cambria, of early Chinese. And this is from 1909. Chinese had a big celebration in Cambria on Tuesday. I don't know who this Cambrian was. LeBeau, couldn't find who he was, had a row with them and ran them away with an axe. I think this photo is a little bit later, but 2 Chinese young men with a roast pig as part of the Chinese New Year celebration. There's a lot of this kind of news in the clippings. I only put up a few, but Chinese pay fines for game violation. A couple of Chinese were arrested for violating fishing laws. And if you read the details, they are allegedly had as much as 1,000 pounds of abalone. But what you see in the second clipping of August is that the court took it easy on them and just levied a $10 and a $20 fine. And as they were leaving, one of them said, this is Long Hope, said, "No likey abalone," which reminds me, of course, that the Chinese here would have spoken Pigden English. Turns out Cayucos had quite a Chinese New Year. This is from 1916, a big gathering there to celebrate the Chinese New Year on February 2nd. And I like this line. I think this is going to make some of you laugh. The Chinese have quite a pretentious church at Cambria. The day is spent in feasting and games. So maybe, in Mendocino, I learned that your temple is supposed to be green and red and probably have more signs and carvings outside. So maybe we need to restore the Cambria temple to be a little more pretentious to match this news clipping. Moving to SLO, I found this photo of the Lewis store, which is, of course, it's there now as a party store. You probably have driven by it. And you know that a parking structure is there where Chinatown used to be. And in the 1916 clipping, which is at the far left, Lewis pledges money to make a proper school for Chinese young people where they will learn to teach English. And you can see that the schoolroom will be in a portion of the old Joss House. So there is, modernization and improvement paid for by Lewis. Interesting that the Chinese here were conscripted into military service. The local exemption board have discovered that Hu Di, a young Chinese who's lived in the Cayucos district, is missing at just the time when summoned to appear for departure to Camp Lewis. So we have a young Chinese evading the draft in 1917 when the United States is entering the war in Europe. This one has a little bit of a positive ring to me. Hauling seaweed to be sent to China. Cayucos. Americo Righetti made several trips to Cayucos last week, assisting in hauling 25 tons of seaweed for the Chinese up the coast. The seaweed is to be sent to Hong Kong. So there's, we'll say business assistance and collaboration. A murder on Highway 1 north of Cayucos. This is from 1921. Seaweed Sam is slain by men in an auto. And I won't read you the full clipping, but it sounds like it was both a Caucasian man and another Chinese who were the alleged assailants, the murderers. They escaped in a vehicle. And after this clipping, there are a number of clippings that express a fear of Tong wars, of a Chinese-style, gang or Tong war coming to the Central Coast. And this clipping, this story, and variations of it were all over the digital news archives because it was a very sensational story at the time. Also a drowning in 1925. I'm going to talk in a minute about China Cove and the area there, but it was known as a smuggling area, but it was also where seaweed was gathered. So 2 Chinese were drowned off the Cayucos coast. They were tangled in a fishing net when the rescuers arrived. Each was 28 years old. And they mention here, in the strip of coast between Cayucos and Cambria, and 2 others narrowly escaped death. Reading this clipping got me interested forward in China Cove, and I went up and hiked it and took some pictures. I've only been here 3.5 years, and you know the area better. So many of you must know that you go about 2 miles north of Cayucos, and that area there is called China Cove. And then the outcropping that I don't know if I have a photo of, but there's an outcropping before you get to Harmony Headlands, that is China Bluff. And that's an area where a lot of seaweed drying happened. That's where a lot of boats came in fishing and also smuggling, I understand. And it was well known as an enclave of Chinese. The last vestige of the early Chinese in Cambria really was the Wong kelp farm. And Wayne's book has a photo that I didn't manage to scan, but instead I found the Shamels left a real estate map. If you look at the very, very bottom of that map, you can see they're on the coast just past Camp Ocean Pines, which was then a YMCA camp. There's the Wong kelp farm. And I spoke to a woman I met on Cambria Currents that I met on social media who used to help Mr. Wong dry seaweed down by the rocks down there. He apparently married a younger wife and was here until the mid-70s. And her experience working with Mr. Wong later led to her attending Cal Poly and becoming a marine biologist. So she'd learned a lot from him, and he apparently had, Chinese could not legally own land in California until after the war. So he had inherited this property from an earlier Chinese relative, but I think inherited meant really homesteading or just, kind of staying on the property and using it. This is one more thing that just came up in my searching, and it was mentioned in Mendocino, and I want to clarify what it is. It's not a racist incident. It was an accident. But there's a beautiful Chinatown and a functioning Taoist temple up in Hanford. And in May of this year, there was a fire. It was later found that the fire was caused by a homeless person. It was caused by a transient. But they have approximately $500,000 worth of damage. And if you go to their website, they're at chinaalley.com, is a website for all of Hanford's Chinatown. They really had a very beautiful temple with a lot of antiques and a lot of artifacts. And if you do go to their website, you can learn more, and they have a PayPal if you want to make a donation to them. And I just think it's kind of a sister temple, maybe 2 hours from us. They are worth supporting and worth interacting with. But I think I'm just going to say, to kind of conclude the presentation, that there's a lot of history to be found here. And that's what the Chinese temple means to me is, when I go inside or when I look at it, I think that's kind of my doorway to the past, to Cambria history. It's really interesting to learn some of the bits and pieces of these stories. And I hope that more stories come forward in the future. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for having me.